Welcome to the Divorce Survival Guide podcast, where we have open and honest conversations about co-parenting, separation, divorce, and the hardest question of all, should you stay or should you go? I'm Kate Anthony, your divorce survival guide, and I'm here to help you navigate some of the roughest waters you've ever swum in and answer some of your toughest questions. I've been to hell and back, and now it's my mission in life to help you get to the other side of this process with your sanity and your heart intact. Hey everyone, welcome back. Today I have a great conversation with Jason VanRuler. Over the years, Jason has worked in everything from the corporate world to the entrepreneurial one, and he has a decade plus of experience as a coach and therapist dedicated to helping others. With extensive experience as a coach, clinician, and speaker, he now owns a private practice. He writes books, gives speeches, and facilitates and leads groups across the world. For Jason, coaching is always equal parts affirming, honest, and compassionate, and his practice has led with this approach when helping every client seeking guidance and direction. Whether it's leadership coaching, relationship building, couples therapy, addiction, trauma, or something different, his goal is always the same: to speak truth and grace to every life he works with. I love this conversation with Jason because he is so very direct and honest and works with clients, I think, especially couples, in a different way than I usually hear about or have experienced myself. And I think he's really cool and really awesome. And you should go follow him on Instagram because he's got great content. And this is a really great conversation. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Jason VanRuler. Jason, thank you so much for coming on to the show. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Kate. I've been looking forward to it.
So, all right, well, let's start off with talking about your new book. This is very exciting because we were both just talking about how we both just published books. So tell us a little bit about your book and what's the main theme and topic.
Yeah, so the book is called Get Past Your Past. And for me, that is a book that is both personal and professional. So I work as a therapist, and so I get to help a lot of people, get over or get through difficult things, divorce even being one of them. But also personally, I've lived that out. And so becoming a therapist and having a full schedule and doing all those things, what I realize is sometimes therapy isn't always so available to people. And so what I wanted to do was to write a book for somebody who was facing something difficult from their past and didn't know where to start. And so that was kind of the genesis of the book, is I want to help those people who have, the way that I kind of pitched it to the publisher was $20 and a little bit of hope. That's where I wanted to meet people, is in that space, and then just kind of walk through what it might look like to do some of the work and to get past the thing and change our relationship with it so we can move on with our life.
I love that. $20 and a little bit of hope, right?
Yeah, it's all it takes.
Yeah, I mean, it really does. And I think that it also speaks to like you said, therapy is not necessarily accessible to everybody, both from a financial perspective or just finding a good therapist in general is really difficult. But then with the state licensure, barriers and not being able to, it's just hard, right? And I think it's gotten easier since the pandemic because people are doing a lot more virtual work, and also harder since the pandemic because a lot more people are seeking therapy. Are you finding that in your practice?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a bummer, but there's no shortage of clients, right? And so I always tell people, I kind of have one of those jobs where if everything was perfect, I'd be out of a job, but I'd be happy about that. But too. It doesn't seem like that's happening anytime soon.
No, it's not. And so getting past your past, right? What is it? How do you see that? Is that sort of an event, or do you see this as trauma, stuff that we're carrying that informs whatever the event is, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's both. What I feel like I'm trying to do is help people change their relationship with what's happened, because we can't change what's happened, right? And so I think as a result of whatever our experience has been, whether it be significant trauma loss or, end of a relationship, whatever those things have been, we have got a relationship with that experience. And there are things that we tell ourselves about ourselves as a result, right? So if we have parents that maybe weren't great parents and they abandon us, we might tell ourselves that we are not worthy of love as a result. And so getting past your past and working through those is going back and saying, okay, my parents might have abandoned me, but what is a more accurate message than I'm not worthy of love? Well, the more accurate message is my parents weren't able to parent me the way they should have, or they chose not to parent me the way they should have.
Mm-hmm. Or they had their own shit to deal with that
exactly
prevented them from doing it. I think that's really interesting. I think there's something that you said in one of your reels on Instagram I was watching recently about how healthy couples, the difference between like how healthy couples and unhealthy couples resolve conflict. And I'm sort of a little bit of a switch, but not really, right? Because I think it's similar in relationships with ourselves and our past, right? That if we don't resolve it, essentially, we are on a shaky foundation. I always say that, like, when you sweep things under the rug, you're standing on a lumpy rug, basically, right?
I love that. That's great.
Yeah, and I think that's the same in relationships, but it's also the same within ourselves, right? We think, well, that happened in the past. It's not really a thing anymore. I'm over it.
Yeah. I mean, I hear that, and that's a convenient thing to say, but
wouldn't that be great?
Right, yeah, I mean,
exactly.
awesome.
Wouldn't it be awesome?
Fantastic. I'm all for it. If there's a pill for that, we should sell it. But the truth is, like, it just doesn't work that way. And so we can have the pain of denial or the pain of dealing with it, but there's going to be some pain and discomfort both ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so in your book, how do you lay out, doing, quote, the work? How do you help people do the work? There's that sort of reading a book is all well and good, but that's not actually doing the work, right? And also we want to give people a book with that moves them just beyond reading the book, right? There's sort of the passive work, and then there's the active work that actually moves the needle. So how do you help people do that in your book?
Yeah, and I love that you bring that up. I am such an action-oriented person, so I sometimes make a bad therapist because I'm always like, well, what are you going to do with this? How are you going to use this? What,
right.
I'm really, really interested in, like, okay, now so what's next? And the book really is just like me, right? So the book is kind of saying, like, here's some information that I think you really ought to know about how we work through this, right? So some of that might be, you have to be honest with yourself about what happened and what your role in that was. Or we need to hold people accountable, or we need to identify community, or all those things I kind of say, like, here you go, here's a thing. And then the questions at the end of the chapter are, here's what you should do with it and how will you do it? And so my goal is not only just to kind of give people that tool, but to empower them to do something. Because to your point, if just reading a book or just listening to, audiobooks or podcasts, like, if that made us a different person, everybody'd be super healthy. We'd
be so great.
It would be awesome. And I'm all for it. It doesn't really work that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we have to actually apply that. And so that's what I'm trying to get people to do, is to see that sometimes the problem isn't that you don't know what to do. It's that you're not doing what you're supposed to do.
Say that again.
Yeah. Sometimes the problem is not that you don't know what to do. It's just that you're not doing what you're supposed to do. And for whatever reason, right? I mean, maybe the hurdle is self-confidence, or maybe the hurdle is, we've been traumatized, whatever that thing is. That's where I'm trying to get people to just do the thing. Because when we're just doing the thing, life gets bigger and things get better. People are
I think they're scared, right? I mean, obviously, they're scared of kind of lifting up the rug that they may have been shoving things under for years or decades or generations, right? Because sometimes we're not just healing our own shit, we're healing the generations that have come before us, right? And I always say, like, be the one, right? Mm-hmm. It just takes one. We're here to break this cycle. Most of this audience are moms who are really looking to break the cycle for their children, right? And I'm really clear, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are, but that, like, it really just takes one.
Yeah, I mean, we can change a legacy in a generation. And so I think if we're going to pass something along, let's pass on health, right? But I think it is work. It is scary. And by the way, not everyone's going to give you a high five for doing it, right? You might not be celebrated initially for trying to become healthier. It's funny, but like that doesn't usually work that way. In fact,
Oh,
people are usually pretty suspicious or even against what you're trying to do. But I think if we commit to that, that is the gift we give, right? As we become the person who changed the trajectory of our family.
there was a post in my Facebook group this morning, somebody divorcing her very abusive and toxic spouse, and had the conversation with him, and it, went okay, difficult, but she went and talked to her dad about it. He was so angry that she was leaving him. And she said, and he said, I lived in, this toxicity all these years with your mom. And she said, well, don't you wish that you had not? And he said, no, I wish she had fixed me.
Okay. Okay.
I was like,
Fair enough.
wow. Right. Sure. Fair enough. But it just speaks to like how people respond. Not everyone's going to be happy that you're moving beyond what they were capable of for themselves.
Yeah. In fact, oftentimes they're going to feel threatened by it.
That's right.
And they're going to feel abandoned. And so they're going to try to keep you where they're at. And so I think just kind of recognizing that before we even get started is really important so that we don't determine our success by the approval of the people we're surrounded by. Because sometimes the people we're surrounded by are more interested and invested in us staying the same than changing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. I always talk about it like, we're all sort of pieces, we're connected sort of pieces in a puzzle, right? We're all pieces of this puzzle called life. And when we start to change the shape of our puzzle piece, puts a lot of stress on all the pieces around us. And they either eventually have to conform or they pop out. And that's,
I like that.
right? Like that stress is like kind of where the rubber meets the road for the work, I think, right? Strengthening ourselves to the point where we can withstand that stress.
And invite those people along the way. I mean, I think the other
Yeah.
part is sometimes we do this black or white thing where it's either like you're coming with me or you're not. And I think sometimes we can do like a middle version, which is just, I'm going to keep inviting you, but I'm not going to return to where you're at. I still want you here. I want you to meet me in this place. I'm just not going back there. And when we do that, I mean, it's interesting because I think sometimes people actually rise to the occasion. They say, like, I actually do want this bad enough. I'm willing to make some changes. And we're surprised. But yeah, I think sometimes one of the biggest hurdles we face when trying to change is just that lots of other things are going to change as well. And sometimes we don't anticipate that.
How do you see that playing out in your practice with couples, right? Because I mean, very often, most often, I would assume, one person is kind of dragging the other into couples therapy, right? And so that is sort of an invitation to change, right? And then how do you see that playing out with the more resistant couple, or the more resistant party? How do you work with that in your practice?
Yeah, well, I think the challenge is it really forces them to make a decision. So they maybe have just been living in a space of not having to do that. And so I will literally tell the person who is more apt to change and who is probably initiating the process, I will say in front of the couple, I'll say to that person, if I really help you get healthy, your marriage is going to come to a breaking point. And I'm not certain what the outcome will be, right? It'll require a decision. We will either be different or we will be separated. Right. And so are you okay with that? Because I think as like a therapist, that's my job to kind of like warn people about some of the side effects of the medicine. Right. So it's like I can help you get healthy, but a side effect is like your marriage might end because in that place of health, you might learn that your person is unwilling to make changes.
I want you to be everybody's couples therapist now, Jason, because most couples therapists actually don't function that way, right? Because the mandate, let's say, is that the relationship is if the relationship is the client, then it feels like all of the work is being geared towards making sure the relationship stays intact. And not a lot of therapists are looking at this saying, actually, if you both grow, it may not, or if one of you grows, right, it may not stay intact. And I don't actually know that I've heard of a lot of therapists saying that. And I think that's fucking brilliant. And it's the truth.
Yeah, I feel like I've seen it happen so much that like I'd be remiss not to say that. And if it's not a healthy relationship, like I don't want to build a wall around it to protect it. So I don't want to say like my primary goal is to like protect a relationship that's not healthy. My primary goal is to help both of you become healthier as much as you're willing, and then make an informed decision. But you have to understand that in that process, that informed decision might be a different situation than you're in right now.
It almost unearths a truth, which is, people come when you come to couples therapy, the unspoken truth is we're coming to see if we can fix this or if we have to break it up. And you're speaking it at the front, which I think most people are not necessarily speaking out loud when they go to therapy, right? They're like, oh, we're here simply to fix it. As though
that's going to happen for everyone. I mean, that's the problem is it's kind of like, well, we're going to fix it, right? Because everyone gets better and every relation, and so I think the thing is like, well, that's just not how it is. Because sometimes it's not going to work. And I hate that. And I wish every relationship worked out. But the truth is it isn't that way. Mm-hmm. And so if we can't be honest from the start, how will it end?
I love that. All right, we're going to take a quick break to hear from one of our sponsors, and then we'll be right back. And now, a quick word from our sponsor. This episode is sponsored by Primis Bank. If you've listened to recent episodes, then you've heard me talk about how important it is to establish a new checking account separate from your spouse. And you've also heard me talk about Primis Bank and all the wonderful resources they've put together for people going through a separation or divorce. Well, there's another fee-free account that they have that gives you more earning potential than most banks' high-yield savings accounts. That's right. Primis Premium Checking comes with one of the nation's highest rates, currently a 5.07 annual percentage yield. And all it takes is $1 to open. So let me say that again, 5.07%. Just like Primis Perks, every Primis Premium account comes with free ATM use nationwide, no overdraft fees. It has early paycheck deposit, plus there is no account maximum, and they'll never cap your interest earnings. Whether you've heard of Primis before or the name is new to you, you should take a look. They are not like your typical online bank. They're a member FDIC, and they have real 24/7 customer service. Plus, the extra work they're doing for their customers, like what they've put together for people who are going through a divorce, is anything but typical. Head on over to primisbank.com/DSG to view more details on Primis Premium Checking and also their other divorce resources like guides, blogs, and so much more. So that is Primis, PRIMIS.com/DSG to take advantage for more resources and to start opening an account today. It really only takes a few minutes. And now back to our show. We're talking about couples work. We're going to shift for a minute and talk about divorce recovery, right? Because that's a big topic of interest to many of our listeners, obviously. When you work with people who are going through an enormous transition like this, what is it that you do with them? What is your, I don't know if you have a theory or a philosophy mandate on it, but what are your thoughts on recovering from something like that?
Yeah, I mean, and it is a difficult process because it is literally life-changing. And often it's identity changing, right? And that's the part we sometimes miss is our identity is very wrapped up into our marriage. And so to go through a divorce actually means we're changing the version or the view that we have of who we are and our identity. So I think really where I start is to grieve the loss of that identity. Even if it was something that you walk away from, you say like, that was a really unhealthy, toxic marriage, there's still grief there. There's grief about what you went through. There's grief about the loss of potential. So we spend some initial time grieving, and then we move into, okay, what can I own from this situation? So what about this have I learned about myself? Well, I needed to have better boundaries, or I should have asked more questions, or whatever it is. And then we begin to cast a vision for the future. So moving forward, what would I want my life to look like? So if I haven't been, and this often happens as a result of divorce, is that people learn they haven't been very intentional with their life. And so if I haven't been very intentional up to this point, how would I live my life if I were going to be intentional? And what's the vision I have for that?
Yeah, I love that. I love that. I also I love the idea of the grieving part. I want to talk a little bit more about that because so many women that I work with or in my communities will say, quote, I wanted this. Why does it hurt so much? And I always say, well, first of all, none of us ever wanted this, right? None of us got married thinking, I can't wait to get divorced, right?
Right.
Right. There is grief in every transition, even if the most happy transition, right? From graduating high school to, moving bedrooms or whatever it is, right? There's any transition, there is going to be grief, even getting married, right? We're going to have to grieve the loss of our singlehood and, and living life as a single person. Why do you think it's so hard for people to wrap their head around the grief of this divorce, which one would think is, I don't know, sort of obvious that one would grieve, but like, it's really hard.
Yeah, I think it's easier to be angry. It's just so much easier to be angry than to be sad about it.
Yeah.
And so it takes us a while for the anger to die down enough for us to actually feel what's going on. Like that,
Yeah.
that's usually not an immediate thing. When I talk to people, I say like, yeah, we're going to grieve this. I mean, I'm usually met with a response, something to the effect of like, well, I'm too angry. I can't even imagine feeling that. But when we give it some time and some space, to your point, there is grief. Even in the most difficult or awful of relationships, there is grief about the transition. And so we have to acknowledge that, because the truth is it's not just going to go away. Just like we talked about putting things under the rug, like just because you don't talk about it doesn't make it go away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I do with my clients, I do a relationship inventory, right? And it sounds like it's a similar process, right? Like what happened and for like, where are your resentments, like everything you resent. And then almost it's loosely based on a fourth step, right? Which is like, okay, these are all your resentments. Now, where might you have had some responsibility? Where might, what are the choices? What's your family history? What brought you to this relationship in this moment? And it sounds like there's a similar aspect.
It's so unpopular though, isn't it? Nobody likes that. No, that's never like no one's always excited to say like, oh, here's what I think I did. But the truth is it's necessary, because what I talk to people about is there is now going to be a story about why this relationship ended. And that narrative is going to be really, really important. And so what exactly is the narrative that you tell yourself? And I'll even say, if you go out and you date and someone asks you why it ends, and people you probably experience this, they always say, well, I'm never going to date again. And I say, okay, sure, you're never going to date again. But if you were to date again and someone was to ask you, why did your marriage end? What do you tell them?
Yeah.
And if you don't have an answer, we need to talk about that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And if your answer is, I hate them and they're awful and terrible and miserable, we're going to have to understand that that's going to affect future relationships.
Right. That may be 100% true, but also does that narrative serve you? And does it serve your process and ability to move forward in your life? Because as they say, carrying a resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, right? Mm-hmm. So here we are, right? He was an asshole and he was a liar and a cheat, all of which may have been 100% true.
But how does that position us, and how does that frame our future?
And that's hard.
It's not easy work.
Yeah, especially when you've been, maligned, right? And you feel really fucking justified in this story.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, like you said, if it's true, I mean, it feels like we deserve to have that story because it's the truth. And so I think some of the challenges, like when you go through this process, it's like you think the next hill is the last, but it isn't.
Right.
And so it's hard for us when we help people through that, because we're kind of like, hey, one more hill, right? And people hate that. I know the first marathon I ever ran, someone, and I think maybe they were well-meaning, but we literally were on one of the final hills, and they screamed out like, "This is the last one," and everyone cheered and was so happy. And then it actually wasn't the last one,
Oh
and that was
God.
sort of a bummer. It turned out there was a couple more hills. And so I think sometimes that's this whole process of going through divorce and getting healthy is like we tell ourselves last hill, totally last hill. And then it's like, but wait, there's another one. And the reason there's another one is because we are still growing. We are not stopping growing. And so there are going to be hills. And so I think the challenge or the progress is actually recognizing that we're choosing a life of hills,
Mm-hmm,
a
mm-hmm.
life of stuckness.
That's right. It's like, the proverbial onion, right? There's always another layer.
Mhm.
And I always say, like, I don't want that. I mean, I hate it. Every time I peel the onion, there's another fucking layer I have to go through. Like, I hate it. And also, once that onion is fully peeled and there's nothing left, then like, that's it. Like, we're at
That
the
is,
end,
we're
right?
done.
We're at the end. We're done. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
there's a certain amount of beauty in the next level, in the next layer. And so it's just sort of changing our mindset from I have to get to this point and then I can quit to I want to be a person who chases progress. I want to be a person who works towards better.
One of the things that is very complicated in healing from divorce is allowing that you're both going to have a different narrative, right? So whatever your narrative is, like, you get to choose it. Hopefully you go to therapy. Hopefully you choose something that's a little bit, you work towards something a little bit more empowering and that moves you forward in that growth. But what do you do when your partner has a narrative that really like gets your goat? Right. And I'm always like, you're never going to agree on the narrative. You're just never going to agree. But yet that does bring up a whole other layer. It's another hill, right? When you realize that they're saying something else.
Well, if you were to agree on narratives, you probably wouldn't be divorced, right? So
Right.
it's kind of like, of course, we're not going to agree on the narrative.
Right.
And I think really it's the healthiest relationships that we have are ones of interdependence where we can feel something and someone else can feel something else and we can still be okay. And so I think as much as we don't like it, that is an opportunity to practice that and just to say, yeah, we all tell ourselves stories about things and you're allowed to tell whatever story you want. Now, I
Yeah.
think if it's, accusatory or it's really terrible, like then we might have to challenge that story. But for the most part, if it's just a different story, I think they're allowed to have it. In fact, it's
Yeah.
probably a testament to why it didn't work. Is we have different stories about our relationship. And by the way, we had for a long time. That's why it didn't work.
Yeah. What if they're flat out lies?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to decide how hurtful and how challenging that's going to make the future. I think if they're flat out lies that don't really cost you anything and they just tell people, I think, whatever. I mean, they're allowed to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Because what I've learned is that when people go through divorce, it feels like the future is going to be exactly how it is today. And the truth is, the dust settles, and the people who lie are eventually shown to be liars. And all you have to do is you have to wait them out. And so it's usually not worth the fight when the evidence will become clear soon enough.
Amen.
Unless you like to fight. If you really like to fight and you're good
Well,
at it, don't let me stop you. But it just usually isn't worth it.
well, it's also why bother getting divorced, right? Don't perpetuate the arguments and the entanglement. You got divorced for a reason. Part of that reason is I'm not going to continue to have this fight. And so if you continue to have this fight, then what's the point? Right.
Right. Because if I thought I could change your mind, we'd still be together.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I'm
Right.
not going to attempt to do the thing that was impossible in our marriage now that we're divorced.
And I think there's so much freedom in that. Have at it. Go ahead. If that's your narrative, bless your cotton socks.
You and I both know bless maybe isn't what you mean there, but yes, bless you.
Not at all.
Bless you all over
Bless
the place.
you.
But
That's right.
But the thing is like, of course, and so people will talk to me about like, well, what if there's kids involved in that narrative? And that is really hard. And so I don't want to say it's not, but I think eventually the truth becomes known and it becomes obvious. And if we can wait long enough and avoid the fight long enough, the kids see it. They see it for how it is.
100%. 100%. I say it all the time. And it sometimes takes a really long time. One of the hardest things I think some of the women in my practice deal with is seeing their ex move on really quickly to someone else, and it looks like their relationship is perfect and he's treating her, like gold when he treated me like shit, and so what was wrong with me? Right. And I generally say, like, if this was an abusive relationship, give it time. It might take 10 years. Give it time. It will play itself out and the kids will see.
Right. And some people are, quite frankly, just better starters than sustainers. They can start relationships very easily and they can make it look wonderful, but they cannot sustain it. And so what often happens when people split up is one person was a starter and one was a sustainer. And so then the starter goes and they start a new relationship and the sustainer says, what is wrong with me that we didn't have that? Well, what's wrong with you is that they have an expiration date on their relationship. That's what's wrong, is that they have an expiration date, you don't. And so eventually you will see that happen.
I love that. All right, we're going to take another quick break and we'll be right back. I want to talk a little bit about addiction. And now a quick word from our sponsor. Surviving divorce is one thing, but surviving divorce with a co-parent who abuses alcohol is a whole different ballgame. Start this year off the way you intend to finish by implementing appropriate safeguards to keep your kids safe. SoberLink is a high-tech breathalyzer system that sends you instant results of a co-parent's alcohol levels. When your co-parent tests, their identity is automatically confirmed with facial recognition, and tamper sensors ensure no cheating has occurred. You then get instant proof that your kids are safe in their care. You guys know I swear by this technology. It is the only tool I recommend to clients dealing with custody and alcohol disputes. Help your family thrive in the new year. Visit www.soberlink.com/DSG to learn more and get $50 off your device. And now back to our show. I said before the break that I want to talk a little bit about addiction. And I know that you have a master's in addiction counseling. Yes? Is that what it is? Yeah. And so how do you see this, playing out? We were also talking about the starters and the sustainers. And I see this a lot with sort of relationship or sex addiction in the beginning of a relationship. Can you speak to that a little bit in your...
Yeah. I mean, I think so many people that struggle with addiction, and especially around like a sexually related issue like pornography or sexual acting out, they struggle to be honest initially about the depth of that, right? Because again, we don't want to kill the deal. And so that's for years I did premarital counseling, and it was my favorite, most frustrating counseling to do, because there's never a problem, right? Because when we're in love, we just want to get to the marriage. Like we don't want to talk about a problem. But it was frustrating because the things that weren't problems as they worked towards marriage became problems when they were married. And so I think the challenge with a lot of addictive behavior is it's the same thing, is it's sort of like they're on their best behavior initially, but the more comfortable they get, the more it becomes problematic until it becomes definitive in the relationship.
Yeah. And so do you work with couples? I mean, usually active addiction is contraindicated for couples work. How do you work with that in your practice?
Yeah, I mean, that's difficult, and it kind of depends on where the couple's at. But a lot of times, if we're doing work with that, I mean, it depends on if we're working towards restoration or what we're trying to do as the outcome. But it's really talking about boundaries and accountability and communication and having conflict and working through it. So what I'll find oftentimes is if someone is with someone in an addictive relationship, they usually kind of, number one, have no idea how they got there. They just didn't see it coming. Yeah. Or B, you have a long history of being in a relationship with people who have addictive behaviors. And so those are both opportunities to learn some of the skills they might have been missing and invite the person struggling with addiction to change.
And that sort of speaks to what we were talking about before, which is doing the work, right? The thing that we don't like to talk about, which is, how did I get here? How did I end up in this relationship? Right. I think there's a bit of a movement afoot of people who, and I don't even know your thoughts on this, so I could be walking into hot water here, but I'm gonna do it anyway. People don't want to talk about, the C word. They don't want to talk about codependence because it's a bad word, and that it's victim blaming. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, let's see.
I'll tell you. Want me to tell you mine first?
Yeah, I love how you asked me.
Yeah,
Here's
right.
what I'm going to tell you. People might not like the word, and that's fair. You don't have to like every word. But the truth is, in relationships, it really defines a way that we show up in relationships as a pattern. And so you might not want to call it that. You might call it, prodependence or dependence or whatever kind of makes you feel better. And I'm okay with that. It's cool. I can learn new words. But I think at the end of the day, the gist of it is sometimes in relationships, we abandon ourselves for the sake of the relationship. And when we do that, people don't show up as their best self because we're not showing up as our best self. And so it is a thing. What do you think?
I agree. I think that codependency is a trauma response, and it's usually a trauma response from early childhood that we have then, created these behavior patterns that we then carry into our relationships in the future. And that relationships with addicts create us to be more codependent, just as being in a relationship with a narcissist causes us to be increasingly empathic. It stretches our capacity to, it broadens our window of tolerance for certain behaviors, right? And we're learning new ways of skirting around it because we're trying to normalize it in our head. Right? Or we're trying to fix it or whatever it is. And those are codependent behaviors. Like, that's just the definition.
It is. I mean, like it or not. And I think a lot of times that's that anxious attachment, right? That comes from literally as a child, not knowing if you're going to be safe or not. And so I've got a lot of grace for people who show up in that spot, because as a child, if you're abandoned or there's no relationship with the parent, you literally will die.
That's right.
And so we learn at a young age to do our best to control the outcome. And so if we can keep a relationship, we will have safety, even if it costs us everything. And the problem with that is that attracts people who are willing to take everything, right? And then they teach us that if we try to work harder, we can in fact control the outcome for them. And so it becomes this system that's just self-reinforcing, not because anyone's bad or terrible or weak. It's just because that's how we've learned to do relationships.
I wish that codependency didn't have such a sort of negative connotation or a bad rap, or that even therapists weren't saying like, I don't like the word codependence, because in my mind, the label gives us an arrow to the roadmap to healing. It's a diagnosis. That's all it is. Just as saying like, you're a sex addict or I'm an alcoholic gives one a roadmap for healing. You can't cure something that's not been diagnosed. Not that
I agree. I think the connotation is that people who tend to, have codependent behaviors or struggle with that, they look at who they're with and they just say, in light of all their bad behavior, how could I be at all responsible for this? How could I at all have something to do with it? And so what we really have to parse out is that the people asking, how can I be responsible for this? Those are the anxiously attached people who always think everything is their fault, right?
Yeah.
And so we have to have the conversation of, this is not your fault, but we want to help you understand how you show up here. And so there's a difference. It's not blaming, it's naming. And if we're naming it, what do we do about it?
Yes, I love that. You also help people with sex addiction, is that right? And
that's correct.
Recovering. And so do you work with the sex addicts or with the partners or both or
all three? Yeah.
All three. Can you briefly describe your process with that and what like some themes that you see in your practice around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think my process, so every time I'm kind of starting with a client, what I'm really trying to get clear on is what are they hiring me to do? Because what's interesting about that is what I would make up they're hiring me to do is not always the thing they're hiring me to do. So, so then when they tell me what they're looking for, we need to get honest really quickly about what's actually happening. And so sometimes just even saying, let's try showing up and being brutally honest about where we're struggling, what's going on, is the start for them to start to make some changes. Because a lot of times in that space, they are not, the person acting out is not being honest with themselves, and they certainly aren't with their person. And so we need to say, like, let's tell the truth and go from there. And then if they're willing to do that and their spouse is willing to work on it too, really the goal is tell them how hard it's going to be, because it is going to be hard, and tell them that we're going to try to make them both healthy people, and that at some point they might not want to do it anymore, and make room for that. and then start to develop accountability and resilience and boundaries and all those things that are the markers of healthy relationships, and to do that slowly and incrementally.
And that requires, I think, on the, on the addict's part, so much honesty and accountability that can be really challenging for an addict, right? That's kind of the
that's sort of the thing they don't want.
The kind of thing
right?
they don't
that's
want,
sort
right?
of like why they're addicts is they're not good at that. And so the invitation is like, if you want a healthy relationship, it'll require you to be willing and to surrender. And I'm not here to make you do that, but I'm here to walk you through that decision.
Jason, this has been such a great conversation. I so appreciate the work that you're doing. Yeah, I love men in this space in particular. People are always asking me like, well, who are the men who are doing the work, right? And it's really, I love talking to men who are in this space and doing this work. And because I think a lot of that is where the shifts and changes need to happen right now. Super, super happy to have had you on the podcast. Where can everybody find you and find your book?
Yeah. Well, if you go to my website, jasonvr.com, you can find links to the book, which is on all the major services like Amazon and Barnes & Noble and that sort of thing, as well as to my social media. So if you are listening to me now and you're thinking, I would love to hear that guy's voice every day, you're in luck. I post on Instagram about every day, and I just try to do healthy relationship content to help us work towards better, exceptional relationships.
So good. Highly recommend Jason's Instagram, by the way. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Oh, it's been an honor. This was fantastic. I'm grateful you had me on.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Divorce Survival Guide podcast. If you like what you hear, head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen in and leave me a review. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram at the Divorce Survival Guide. I'll see you next time, and until then, remember, you, my love, deserve to be happy.